Welcome to the F4 hydrogen model. This is a levelized cost and emissions model that compares blue hydrogen and then two types of green hydrogen, taking technical inputs, cost inputs, and outputting what every kilogram of hydrogen for each type should cost and how much greenhouse gas is emitted in the process. I built this because well, as anyone who studies hydrogen knows, forecasts for green hydrogen prices out in public are extremely wide. It's very hard to tell which ones are being too conservative, which are being too aggressive, because there are just so many factors that go into that cost. And so I wanted to have my own model that would allow me to look at those factors, make my own assumptions, and see what they output. So I built this off of the US Department of Energy's H2A models, which are fantastically detailed, and really grateful to the team there for putting these out. Those models are a little bit tough to use, especially for beginners, but even for experts, they're a little bit inflexible when it comes to looking at cause and effect, and each model covers one technology, so they can't easily be compared against each other. So I took the base of those models, input it all into here. I built a lot of other assumptions on top of them, converted all into very large tables, doing all the math, and then this is what it comes out to at the end. So everyone should be able to put in their own assumptions here and figure out what the outputs are. And additionally, I took a lot of studies data on hydrogen and made them into charts that allow you to sanity check the output of this model against what other studies have found. So there are a lot of additional notes here and on the cover, but the core of it is I am doing this as an independent analyst. This is all purely open source data coming from entirely public sources. No company or other entities sponsored this. If you look at f4blog.org, you'll see a lot of other work I've done. The best course summary I can give behind why I do this work is that it's all born out of equal parts excitement about clean energy, but frustration with limitations of current sources out in public. So there's some things that I just feel, I need to be able to dig deeper on. And so then I build some kind of product, and I try to put those out in public because I assume that I'm not the only person who will find that useful. So with that, thank you for checking this out. And the rest of this video is going to dive into more technical detail on how this model works. Let's start with the end product for the model. This is the display tab. It shows all the outputs for each type of hydrogen. The first type covered here, SMR blue hydrogen, that is steam methane reformation, which is taking the methane in natural gas, CH4, and under high heat, splitting it apart into hydrogen molecules and letting the carbon combine with oxygen into CO2 and emitting it as a waste product. Traditional SMR, releasing the CO2 into the air, is gray hydrogen, and it's very, very carbon intensive. Blue hydrogen is when you take that process and add carbon capture to it to capture a lot of the emissions that come off, making it less carbon intensive. Green hydrogen is made using electricity and electrolysis. It is green if that electricity is all renewable, which means that no carbon is emitted. And the two types I show here are two of the leading types, but there are other electrolysis forms. These are solid oxide and PEM, which is polymer electrolyte membrane. The notes have some more detail. Basically, these are they each have pros and cons in different situations. So which one you want to use will depend upon each site and use case. So this shows the buildup for each component cost, including upfront costs, the operating and maintenance costs, electricity inputs into the total cost that hydrogen would need to be sold for to make the project financially balance out. And so as you can see down here in the chart, the dominant cost for SMR blue hydrogen is natural gas inputs. The dominant cost for the electrolyzers is electricity inputs. And as you change factors within the model, you'll see those charts move around. A couple of inputs that matter here are cost of capital. And cost of capital is just a metric for a project finance model of any of these. And it shows how much of a return the investor in the project needs to make back in order to get a high enough financial return to finance everything in the first place. So if you make cost of capital 0%, you'll get the pure cost without needing to return that profit. So for blue, it would take things down to 148. If you have an 8% cost of capital, which is somewhere in the somewhat risky commercial return threshold, you'll get up to 167. And then there's also the emissions inputs, which don't really matter for green hydrogen, but are very important for blue. So there's the DOE option, which has 2.67 kilograms emitted, and then the custom option has a little bit more. And when we go into the emissions tab, I'll talk about why that is. But that's the core functionality of this tab. Whenever you make any change throughout the rest of the model, everything will roll up automatically and display here for final results. Also, one very important technical note, this model does have circular references to be able to automatically calculate everything. So if you are seeing an error in the way calculations are flowing through, what you can do is go to File, Options, Formulas, and then in the top right, you should be able to see an option to enable iterative calculations. And that, I think it should automatically be switched on when you open this model, but if it's not working, try that and everything should function. All right, and then starting from this end product, the next one to look at is cash flows. So we don't need to spend a ton of time here. This is the table where, as you can see over here, you have year, you have each technology types. There's 3 different sections here. And this just does all of the calculations for hydrogen revenue through all of the cost components, all of the inputs, everything going in, finally calculating taxes and cumulative cash flow out at the end. So everything in display is flowing directly from cash flows. This is the area where all of the detailed math is being done. So if something in the model breaks, it is probably something that broke in here. And if it does break, please feel free to reach out to me at the information shown on this tab, and I will do my best to get things put right as quickly as I can. From cash flows, let's start jumping into the input tabs. So this is high-level inputs. It covers start year, end year, tax rate, input costs over the years, a lot of really core factors that are important to the final price. One thing that I want to show, all of these are pretty important. I try to include detailed notes that walk through how everything works, but if things are unclear, again, please reach out to me and I can put out an updated version. One thing I'd like to cover here, solid oxide waste heat use, just as an example of how these levers can impact the model pretty heavily. Solid oxide electrolyzers are significantly more efficient than PEM electrolyzers, but they need to operate at high heat. And so some of that efficiency gain gets canceled out if they need to use an external energy source to keep that heat high. But if solid oxide electrolyzers are able to use a waste heat source, like from an industrial facility that they're attached to, they do get a really large efficiency advantage. So right now, there is no waste heat being assumed. Solid oxide costs $3.67. If we assume 100% waste heat, which means that all of that energy is being provided externally, the cost drops to $3.06, which just goes to show how big an impact that has for solid oxide. Another really important thing for the electrolyzer cases is that, well, one of the core cost drivers for green hydrogen is the upfront capital expense of the electrolyzers. And we're going to go into this tab next, but I would not recommend changing the electrolyzer costs on this tab, but it's a really key lever to be able to mess with. So I created this manual entry switch, which means that when this is on, you can activate this table where you can input any electrolyzer price you would like to. And the current costs in there are based on the DOE's forecast for future electrolyzer costs. instead of current ones, which are input in the model. So if we turn this on, we can see what the DOE believes hydrogen will cost in the future when electrolyzers get significantly cheaper. And as you can see, that made a pretty huge difference to both solid oxide and to PEM electrolyzers. So just a few examples of what this tab can do. And next we'll dive into the really detailed tab. All right, I got more coffee. And for those who are still with me, time to dive deeper into the rabbit hole. So this is the technical inputs tab. And this is really the core foundation of the model. I took these numbers all out of the DOE's models and built the rest of the structure around them. So over here, we have the description of each factor, a lot of tagging categories to keep it organized. Here are the 3 technology types. Obviously, for some things are only relevant to one of the types, so not all of these values are filled out. And I would say that if you are not familiar with detailed technical statistics for these technologies or detailed project finance or engineering, I would not recommend changing this part of the model. I'd recommend sticking to these other kind of higher level input tabs. But if you are at that level of familiarity, then feel free to go for it. This will allow you to tailor everything about the way the model works. To make things a little bit easier to track, I also added the tabs in the DOE models that each of these is on. So if you want to go look at the assumptions underlying capacity factor for each of these, you can go and check this tab in the DOE's models and track it down and figure out which of these assumptions that you agree with and which you don't. And very important caveat on that, DOE is not, they are experts, but this technology is constantly evolving. So just because the DOE had a certain number in its model whenever it was last updated does not mean that is a number that will apply to every company providing these technologies all the time, especially when it comes to green hydrogen, which is one of the fastest growing sectors of green energy. There are companies that already have in their laboratories or their warehouses better technology than has been shown and modeled in public. So just because this model says hydrogen from a certain method should cost something, that does not mean that every technology that's being offered in the market, especially everyone that's going to be offered in the next few years, actually will have that price. It's just the latest, open source public value that's available. But again, every company working on this is going to have its own perspective. And if you are comfortable working with this level of the model, and you want to make different assumptions about what companies are capable of, this will allow you to have granular control over everything that feeds the final results. Let's jump now to emissions inputs. This tab controls the greenhouse gas emission assumptions across the entire model. Matters the most for blue hydrogen because it's using natural gas. One thing I want to dive into is that there's currently a very active debate over the real extent of methane leakage. So methane is the core component of natural gas. And when natural gas is produced and transmitted, sometimes methane leaks out of the facilities, out of the pipes, etc. And when methane is burned and emits carbon dioxide, that accelerates climate change, but it's actually not as bad as if methane leaks out of the pipe in the process, because methane on its own is a more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So the more methane leaks, the more global warming impact use of natural gas has. And so there's a lot of current research that is alleging that mainstream prior assumptions about methane leaks, which are reflected in the DOE's numbers in these models, are unfortunately too optimistic. So in this tab, I allow looking at the DOE's assumptions here, and I also add a custom set of assumptions here. So this is driven by a custom methane leak rate input here. Currently has 2.54%, which is fitting for the US. There's some more detail on that right here. And based on that assumption, the amount of climate impact of blue hydrogen is significantly higher in the custom case than in the DOE case. And if you raise this input, you raise the result there. And on the display tab, you can flip back and forth between the DOE's numbers and the custom numbers. And as you can see, if you assume elevated methane leak rates, you get a lot more climate impact for blue hydrogen. Now that is the core point, and a lot of arguing within industry right now over whether it even makes any sense to develop blue hydrogen, because depending on how much methane you assume is being leaked in the natural gas process, you can make a case that blue hydrogen is really not that much better than gray hydrogen. So personally, I actually lean more towards the side that green hydrogen is what we should be focusing on, and blue hydrogen is not, I do think it's an improvement from gray hydrogen, but I don't think it's enough of an improvement to be worth the amount of money that governments are investing in it. But that is something that I definitely encourage people to wade into on their own, because there are a lot of good arguments from many directions. I actually dive into this a little bit more in my clean fuels deck that's on f4blog.org. And the sources for that deck contain a lot of the best points being made on all sides of this debate, which has gotten very, very heated recently. So for those who really want to dive into the detail, I recommend going there. For the purposes of this model, feel free to just find your own assumptions here to plug in. There is no right methane leak assumption for every case. It depends what country you're in. Even within a country like the US, there is wide variation between companies that are careful about methane leaks and companies that aren't. So what that input should be will really depend on a case-by-case basis. I built this model trying to make it as flexible as possible for users to make their own assumptions. And there are also some other factors on this tab that are useful to mess with. Again, I tried to include notes that made it clear how everything is working. But if things are unclear, or if there are other factors that you think should be added, please don't hesitate to reach out, and I can include updates in future versions. All right, moving to depreciation. Just like I didn't recommend changing anything in technical inputs unless you are familiar, with kind of the on-the-ground workings of these technologies. I would not recommend changing depreciation, anything on this tab, unless you are familiar with the way that the financing works. At core, depreciation is just the speed at which companies can write off the degradation of their assets. So basically, as any technology you deploy gets older, you're losing value as it moves towards retirement, and you're able to write off those losses against your profits for tax reasons. And so for companies, in all of these cases, 100% of the value gets written off by the end of the period. But if you have a faster recovery period, that means the company can save more money up front, which gives it additional cash to be able to invest in operations. So from the company's perspective, the shorter the recovery period is, the better the project is going to be financially. So this shows all of the possible recovery periods, high-level inputs. Oh no, it's actually Raven. Is it? Okay, here it is. Okay, so it's in taxation here. Right now it's set to a 5-year return window. So you have the option for any of these. Makers is a standard US tax policy. So for anyone doing this in Europe, you are going to want to change those assumptions a bit. Again, this is not an area that I would worry about unless you are a financial analyst and you've done depreciation math before. That actually concludes the core operational part of the model, but there are some other tabs I'd like to run through as well that are really helpful. So this cross-reference tab draws from a fantastic meta-analysis that collected a lot of different hydrogen studies across gray, blue, green, even black coal-produced hydrogen. And it gave me levelized costs across a bunch of different cases, different regions, different carbon capture assumptions, different capex and electricity costs. not many people will get really excited about this, but I thought it was great. And if you're still here at this point in the video, you might really find this cool too, because what this allows is it gives a baseline to compare the results of the model and see if they line up with what other sources are saying makes sense. So I made this table out of this data, and it shows across these different production types of hydrogen what costs are coming out. So each of these bands shows a certain type, color coded up here. This is the most expensive result. This is the least expensive result. And all of these regular dots are from studies, and the outputs of the models are shown with a bold cost and a bold black border. So as you can see, against all these studies, blue hydrogen is coming out, and the model is coming out, on the lower end of this range. PEM is coming out kind of on the lower end of the overall electrolysis range. Lone solid oxide value comes out of this model because none of those studies have covered solid oxide. For many reasons, solid oxide is a little bit of a dark horse in the public, in terms of public cost models. But it's also coming out at a reasonable place in the electrolysis map. So this allows you to look and show, okay, based on the assumptions you're putting in, where are things falling? Right now, they're falling in a place that I think makes a lot of sense. If you see these costs drop below these ranges or go significantly above, you can guess there's something in your inputs that might not be aligned with what the rest of the market is saying. There's also some other functions here. I added charts that, again, not many other people are going to think this is great, but I found very useful. I compared for green electrolyzed hydrogen, the cost of the capital expense against the final production cost, the cost of electricity against the final production cost. Unsurprisingly, as these costs go up, the overall cost of hydrogen goes up too. You can see the correlation line right there. I also made what some people might see as a nightmarish bubble chart that shows the capex on one axis, the electricity cost on the other, and the size of the circle is hydrogen per kilogram. I'm not sure that's going to be useful to anyone except for me, but it just goes to show that this is a really rich data set that can be used for a lot of different analysis. There's also some emissions potential estimates that I didn't even touch. There's a lot of scope to make more assumptions there. So again, this is just a great source for comparing the results of the model against other analyses and seeing if what your assumptions show in terms of final results are aligning with other findings out there made by experts. And then one final thing, comparison data is not a separate tab. It is actually a reprint of the cross-reference data, except it's copied to be used as the graph references for each graph in turn here. So if you'd like to run your own analysis of these charts, I'd recommend going in, looking at the data that these charts are selecting here, and then making the same types of tables to support that, pulling from these original numbers. All right, with that, you are now ready to go make this model your own, make your own assumptions and see how things come out. Again, hydrogen is a really exciting area, but based purely on public information, it can be pretty tough to tell whether the revolution is coming next year, it's going to take 15 years. It's tough to tell when a breakthrough gets made in a certain area, how it's going to impact the overall results. So I just wanted this to be a tool for people to be able to do that analysis for themselves and figure out cause and effect and make their own projections. So again, as I've said throughout, this is the kind of thing that I am definitely open to updating. If you have suggestions, ideas, recommendations, all of my contact information is here. And broadly, I mean, if you go on f4blog.org, you can see the kind of things I've worked on. I really want to make tools that are useful to me and useful to other people as well. So if you have ideas on how this kind of analysis can be better tailored to something as a real application, please reach out, and I'm more than happy to talk about what else I'm working on and what else I could do. Good luck. Thank you for listening. And I hope to hear from anyone who finds this model useful in what they're working on.